Andrew, we haven't talked to you since this all went down, so I'm curious what your thoughts are with a day to really marinate on this. And also, I'm wondering if, like me, you agree that Donald Trump's life, like it or not, has changed. He has been accused, he has been arraigned, accused of 34 felony counts, and as a result, everything he does now is under the microscope. He can't just be Trump anymore and riff and threaten and defame
but
people
he's still doing it
without potential consequences.
Yeah.
So I think we are seeing now, and we will continue to see, particularly if there are additional charges in Georgia and federally, that there is a clash between Trump, the politician, and his legal interests. Because now he is not former President Trump, he is defendant Trump. He is out on bail. And that means that a judge does have the power to curtail certainly any sort of incitement to violence that he engages in. The DA could also charge him if he continues to do things like post photos with him in a bat and a picture of the DA. So anything that approaches that is going to be subject to judges overseeing him. And I have to say, if he is federally charged, it is, in general, federal judges take that, I think, more seriously and have a few more tools to curtail that kind of conduct.
Understanding he's running for president, also that a lot of the calculations he made on how early he'd run for president was because he anticipated being indicted and wanted to use that against any case. Understanding that he's got First Amendment rights and political speech is the most protected right, I'm wondering how much latitude is this judge going to give Donald Trump to continue insulting the judge, his family, the DA, whipping up
scaring witnesses,
whipping up hatred, and certainly among his base, and causing the judge and the DA to have to get security. I mean, Andrew, at what point does he find him in contempt?
So I think there are two things to separate. One is talking about the case, and the other is language that is inciting or imploring people or suggesting violence. As Jen probably can say, you can run for office and not incite violence. So there is no sort of concern, I would think, about your sort of First Amendment rights in terms of running for office and talking about policies, or even saying you're innocent of these charges and they shouldn't have been brought. None of that means that you have a right to incite violence, and it shouldn't implicate in any way his being a candidate or our right to decide which candidate we want to vote for. And I'm confident that is the way Judge Merchan, who was overseeing the case in New York, is going to see this. If he continues doing this, it's a little like having a 2-year-old where you have incremental punishment. That is the reason that we had the judge at the arraignment, which is very unusual at that stage, admonishing both sides, even though only one side was doing it, to curtail the kind of rhetoric and speech that had been engaged in. At some point, that will become an order from the court. And the reason that is relevant is if you violate a court order, there are all sorts of sanctions that can be imposed, not just fines, but it can also include actually being jailed or being prohibited from making all sorts of inflammatory remarks in public speeches or in social media.
And despite that warning from the judge, of course, Donald Trump and his family members have spent the last 2 days going after the judge's family, and everything else. Another story for you, Andrew, and that is former Vice President Mike Pence saying he will not fight a subpoena to appear before Jack Smith and the special counsel around the January 6th investigation. He was going to have to show up anyway, so maybe that's just ceremonial, but he had said that he wasn't going to show up initially. What is the significance of that, and what do you expect Jack Smith wants to know from Mike Pence?
Huge development for Jack Smith, both in terms of the so-called January 6th investigation, even potentially with respect to the Mar-a-Lago case, because Mike Pence can talk to the kind of training and what he was told about what documents he could take and not take. And in fact, he has made some suggestion that he was told exactly what the rules of the road were, which would not be a good development for the former president. I think that one of the most important things that Mike Pence could testify to is with respect to a tweet that the former president issued on January 5th, one day before January 6th, where the president said that the vice president agreed with him, Donald Trump, that the vice president had the power not to certify the election and not to count the votes. And it seems to me that the vice president is on record in his book, at least, in his book tour, saying that is not true. Why is that relevant? If you can show that the president of the United States was intentionally lying on January 5th, and it was a way to sort of foment what happened on January 6th, it is pretty much game over. This is a case that's going to involve intent and what the then president thought. And this is something that the vice president will have direct knowledge of, that what was being said by the president on January 5th was not true.
Andrew, before you go, another difference for Donald Trump's reality is one expert earlier this week said that, if his rhetoric and his words become, if they influence witnesses, if they influence the case and they become dangerous, that the prosecution could ask the judge to move the case up. Has that been done before? And is that a possibility you see here?
It could be done. I don't think that would be the likely outcome of doing that. I think that a more likely outcome would be an order from the court as to what Donald Trump could or could not say and what he could or could not do. As I said, it could also lead to fines, and if it continues after that, he could actually be in jail pending trial. In other words, Donald Trump, for the first time in his life, is actually not in control here. The judge is in control.
Yep, he has got to answer. NBC News legal analyst Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much.